The night was so unnaturally quiet that even the air felt suspended, as if London itself were holding its breath. In the basement of a windowless government building, far below the rumble of distant sirens, three men gathered around a single photograph laid carefully at the center of a steel table. It was an ordinary image, a simple wartime poster, faded at the edges, but the tension in the room suggested it held a secret far more dangerous than any weapon the enemy possessed. For the first time since the war began, the Allies weren't studying maps or intercepted signals, they were studying people. Dr. James Vickery, a thin, soft-spoken American psychologist temporarily embedded with the British Ministry of Information, stood motionless as he examined the photograph under the dim yellow lamp. He didn't wear a uniform. He had never set foot on a battlefield. But in the space of a few months, his research had become so critical that generals who once dismissed psychology as soft science now waited for his briefings with growing urgency. Vickery wasn't dealing with troop positions or enemy codes. He was deciphering something far more universal: how the human mind makes decisions under stress, fear, and uncertainty. Across the table, British officer LT Harold Dunmore finally broke the silence with a shaky exhale. He had just returned from an emergency meeting, one where Churchill himself demanded a new line of attack. Not bombs, not tanks. Something more subtle, more invisible. A force the enemy couldn't intercept or defend against. Influence. "So you're telling me," Dunmore muttered, tapping the edge of the poster, "that this harmless little image can make a man act without realizing it?" Vickery looked up slowly, his tired eyes steady. "Not can, Harold," he replied. "It already does." Dunmore froze. There was no bravado in Vickery's voice, no excitement, only certainty, the kind that comes from hundreds of interviews, wartime behavior logs, ration line observations, and psychological reports compiled during the Blitz. The evidence was overwhelming. Civilians and soldiers alike responded predictably to certain emotional triggers. Fear sharpened obedience. Scarcity accelerated action. Repetition bypassed doubt. Authority dissolved hesitation. Hope could redirect entire populations. The ministry wasn't just creating posters or radio messages. They were building something more precise, a behavioral algorithm. Long before the term existed, a mental lever system, a psychological code. Above them, muffled explosions shook dust from the rafters, but none of the men looked up. The threat outside mattered less than the discovery inside this room. If thoughts could be influenced with predictable patterns, then wars could be shaped without a single shot. Vickery flipped through pages of his notebook filled with sketches, emotional graphs, and margin notes. He had identified the shortcuts the human brain relied on in moments of panic, shortcuts that made people predictable. And predictability could be he didn't know it yet, but the wartime code they were crafting would not disappear when peace returned. It would evolve. It would migrate into advertising agencies, political campaigns, supermarket aisles, television screens, influencing millions long after the smoke of war cleared. On that cold night in 1943, in a silent basement beneath a battered city, the psychological code of World War II was born. And the world, especially the world of business, would never be the same. The following morning, the team met inside a cramped briefing room that smelled of damp wool and burnt coffee. A gray fog pressed against the windows, muffling the sounds of a city still trembling from the night's air raids. Dr. Vickery stood before a cluttered with half-erased diagrams, circles, and arrows, remnants of long nights spent mapping what he now called behavioral triggers. LT Harold Dunmore leaned back in his chair, arms crossed, trying to grasp the scale of what Vickery had uncovered. But someone new sat at the table that morning. Commander Elsie Wood, a sharp-eyed officer from the British Psychological Warfare Division, known for her ruthless efficiency and unsettling ability to read a room before anyone spoke. Her presence meant one thing: the experiment was moving forward. Vickery tapped chalk against the board. "We're not here to manipulate people," he began cautiously, choosing his words with academic precision. "We're here to understand how fear, pressure, and uncertainty shape decisions. If we can predict behavior, we can reduce casualties. We can guide the public calmly through chaos." Whitford raised an eyebrow. unconvinced. "Doctor, with respect, the Prime Minister is not interested in philosophical benefits. He wants results." Her voice was steady, but her tone carried the weight of military urgency. If your code works, it becomes a weapon, one that can turn the tide without firing a shot. That afternoon, the three moved to the ministry's underground test chamber, a narrow, bunker-like space lined with clipboards, questionnaires, and an early film projector. Hundreds of civilians had volunteered over the past year to participate in what they believed were morale studies. None of them knew they were part of the earliest structured research into predictive emotional influence, a field that would later become the backbone of the global advertising industry. Vickery remembered one interview vividly. A mother who admitted she bought war bonds, not because she understood them, but because a poster made her feel guilty for not supporting the troops. This wasn't manipulation. It was a mirror held up to the unconscious mind. Vickery dimmed the lights and loaded a reel into the projector. The film featured a sequence of ordinary scenarios. A father rationing food, a young woman placing a coin into a war bond box, a soldier receiving a letter at the front. The scenes were simple, but the narration was crafted using the psychological principles Vickery had identified: scarcity, authority, emotional contrast, and moral obligation. As the film rolled, Whitford watched the participants from behind a pane of mirrored glass. She saw their posture shift, their pupils dilate, their breathing synchronize with the narration. It wasn't hypnosis, it was something far more subtle: alignment. When the lights came up, Vickery collected the questionnaire. The patterns were undeniable. People who had entered the room indifferent now felt compelled to take action. Conserve fuel, donate fabric, volunteer, buy bonds. Not because the film instructed them, but because it triggered the same mental shortcuts that panic and danger had carved into their minds since the Blitz. Dunmore exhaled slowly. "So it's real," he whispered. "This code, it works on anyone." Vickery didn't smile. He didn't celebrate. Instead, he stared at the stack of questionnaire with a growing heaviness. The power in those pages was enormous enough to guide millions, influence nations, even reshape the future of communication. What unsettled him was not the code's effectiveness. It was the realization that once this knowledge existed, it could never truly be contained. And someday, long after the war ended, someone would inevitably use it for profit. The next weeks unfolded inside a blur of dim corridors, coded memos, and long nights beneath the city. London shook under the relentless hum of war, but inside the Ministry of Information, a different kind of battle was taking shape. One fought not on fields, but within the fragile architecture of human thought. Dr. Vickery barely slept, his notebooks filled with sketches of emotional cycles, diagrams of decision pathways, and transcripts from interviews conducted in bomb shelters during the Blitz. Every data point revealed the same conclusion: under sustained pressure, the human mind leaned on shortcuts, patterns as predictable as the rising sun. It was these shortcuts, Vickery believed, that formed the backbone of what he now quietly called the blueprint. Commander Elsie Whitford pushed the team harder. She knew the stakes. Civilians were exhausted, resources were thin, and morale fluctuated with every broadcast from the Reich. If the Allies failed to understand how civilians processed fear, hope, and fatigue, the entire home front could erode. "This isn't about persuasion," she insisted one evening, her voice echoing off the concrete walls. "It's about survival. If the public collapses, the war collapses." Vickery nodded. But deep inside, he sensed something else growing, an uneasiness about how the blueprint might evolve after the fighting stopped. Tools built in desperation rarely stayed in the shadows. To refine their work, the team began analyzing propaganda from every nation axis, allied, neutral, not to imitate it, but to dissect it. Each poster, broadcast, and slogan was broken apart like a mechanical device. What emotion did it target? What fear did it exploit? What authority did it lean on? In a thick binder labeled pattern recognition, civilian response, Vickery charted how specific colors altered trust levels, how symmetrical faces performed better in recruitment posters, and how simple, repetitive slogans bypassed skepticism. Whitford added her own observations. Civilians were more responsive to messages framed as moral duty rather than personal benefit. Guilt was powerful, but purpose was stronger. One afternoon, while studying ration book trends, Vickery discovered something startling. Families were not responding to logical arguments about scarcity. They were responding to stories, narratives of shared sacrifice, imagined futures, and collective identity. The blueprint wasn't a formula or a collection of tricks. It was a narrative engine. Influence wasn't achieved by commanding people. It was achieved by giving them a story to join. Dunmore, leaning over Vickery's shoulder, murmured, "So the real weapon is Menem?" Vickery closed his notebook, realizing Dunmore had articulated what he himself had struggled to name. Meaning was the true catalyst. To test this revelation, the ministry crafted a series of radio broadcasts built around ordinary characters: a nurse, a factory worker, a soldier writing home. Their stories were fictional, but every emotional detail was grounded in real wartime life. When the broadcasts aired, postal offices were flooded with letters from listeners claiming they felt less alone, felt braver, or felt it was their duty to do more. Whitford placed one such letter on the table and simply said, "This is influence without force." Vickery stared at the handwriting, realizing how delicate yet potent the blueprint had become. But with every success came a deeper unease. If stories could move nations, then nations could someday be moved for reasons entirely detached from survival or justice. The blueprint was powerful. Too powerful, and Vickery knew that once the war ended, this discovery wouldn't disappear. Someone, somewhere, would see in it an opportunity, not to save a nation, but to shape consumers, elections, beliefs. The blueprint had been born out of necessity, but its future would not be bound to war. By early 1944, the Ministry's psychological unit had become one of the most confidential branches in the Allied communications network. Their success was undeniable. Ration compliance rose. War bond purchases surged. Civilian morale, though battered, remained stable. The blueprint was no longer theory, it was operational. But what Vickery did to know was that news of their breakthroughs had begun leaking across the Atlantic, not through spies or defectors, but through whispers traded over coffee in Washington, offices through ambiguous reports sent to American agencies, and through the ambitious curiosity of a rising new power, the advertising industry. Representatives from the U.S. Office of War Information visited London under the guise of coordination meetings. But Vickery quickly noticed something odd in their questions. They weren't interested in the logistics of broadcasts or the mathematics of poster distribution. They wanted to know about emotional triggers, about repetition cycles, about the subconscious effect of imagery. One coordinator, a polished, fast-talking man named Richard Halden, who claimed he had temporarily stepped away from Madison Avenue, lingered after a briefing. "Doctor," he asked casually, "have you considered what this could mean for peacetime communication?" Vickery stiffened. He had considered it. And he feared it. Weeks later, Whitford invited Vickery into her office, where a classified memo lay open on her desk. "American agencies are asking for access to your research," she said. Her tone an uneasy mix of pride and concern. "They want to adapt the blueprint for domestic programs, public safety campaigns, health initiatives, maybe more." She drummed her fingers on the folder. "We don't get to choose how knowledge spreads." Vickery swallowed hard. He wasn't naive. He knew that wartime discoveries often escaped their intended purpose. But hearing it confirmed, hearing that his psychological code might soon extend far beyond the battlefield, unsettled him in a way enemy propaganda never could. To prepare for the inevitable transfer, the ministry conducted a final series of tests, controlled scenarios, observing how individuals responded to various combinations of imagery, narrative pacing, and emotional sequencing. Dunmore watched through the mirrored glass as civilians reacted exactly as the blueprint predicted, their decisions shifting in subtle but measurable ways. "It's frightening how easy it is," he whispered. Vickery didn't answer, because deep down, he knew the frightening part wasn't the blueprint's strength, it was its stability. The code didn't break across age, class, or education. It worked because it wasn't manipulation. It was simply the way the human brain operated. When the Americans finally received a curated version of the research, They were astonished. Holden, reviewing a draft summary, reportedly muttered, "This could sell anything." And that statement, simple as it was, marked a turning point. Wartime necessity became peacetime opportunity. What began as a tool to protect civilians during air raids started drifting toward a future lined with billboards, magazine spreads, supermarket studies, and television ads. The blueprint had taken its first step out of the shadows and into the world of commerce. Vickery returned home late that night, walking through the dim streets of London as snowflakes fell quietly around him. The war raged on, but something irreversible had happened. The psychological code, once buried beneath the weight of survival, now had the attention of people whose motivations had nothing to do with freedom or victory. People who saw in the blueprint not a shield, but a market. Vickery paused under a flickering street lamp, wondering whether the world understood the power it was about to unleash. The answer, he feared, was no. When the war finally ended in 1945, celebrations erupted across Europe and the United States. Bells rang, flags waved. Crowds filled the streets in tearful relief. But inside the Ministry of Information, the atmosphere was strangely muted. The staff, who had lived in underground rooms for years, began packing boxes, burning classified scraps, and preparing to return to civilian lives. Yet Dr. James Vickery remained still at his desk, staring at a stack of files stamped "Restricted Psychological Operations." The blueprint had fulfilled its wartime purpose, but Vickery knew something essential. Ideas this powerful did not simply disappear when peace arrived. They encrypted. Commander Elsie Whitford approached him one afternoon as workers dismantled filing cabinets around them. "You should be proud, James," she said quietly. "Your research helped hold this country together." But Vickery did not. Pride wasn't what he felt. Instead, he felt the weight of responsibility pressing harder than ever. "Elsie," he said, "we've opened a door we can't close." She sighed, understanding more than she admitted. If we hadn't built a blueprint, we'd have lost the home front. Sometimes survival demands uncomfortable tools. Vickery didn't argue. Bate Kuldentishe, the fear that survival was only the beginning. While Europe rebuilt its ruins, something else was taking shape across the Atlantic. In New York, offices along Madison Avenue were swelling with returning veterans and ambitious young businessmen eager to harness the post-war economic boom. Among them was Richard Holden, the same visitor who had quietly absorbed everything Vickery's team had discovered. Holden had resumed his career at a rising advertising firm, and he brought something priceless with him: exposure to the most advanced psychological research on influence ever conducted. The blueprint's principles were now flowing into a world completely unprepared for their sophistication. During a rare visit to the United States in late 1946, Vickery wandered through a bustling department store in Chicago and felt his stomach twist. Bright posters used color combinations identical to wartime morale campaigns. Product displays manipulated scarcity cues. Sales scripts echoed the emotional sequencing from the ministry's experiments. None of it was illegal. None of it was openly harmful. But all of it was engineered. The same levers, designed to guide civilians through fear, were now being used to sell soap, cigarettes, and canned fruit. Vickery stood frozen in the aisle, realizing that commerce had seamlessly absorbed methods once reserved for national survival. Meanwhile, Whitford sent him a letter from London warning that political groups were also studying influence strategies. "Every nation is learning," she wrote. "They'll all use it, some responsibly, many not." Her words haunted him. The blueprint had been created under dire necessity, a shield for a nation under fire. But in a peacetime world hungry for growth, competition, and persuasion, the code's purpose was mute. Its emotional triggers, its behavioral predictions, its narrative structures, all were becoming tools for industries with no moral framework beyond profit. On a quiet evening, Vickery sat alone at a diner in Manhattan, nursing a cup of black coffee. Around him, ordinary people laughed, read newspapers, and browsed colorful magazine ads, without realizing they were interacting with psychological patterns born in the darkest years of the war. Vickery watched them, wondering if they sensed it, the invisible hands guiding choices, moods, impulses? They did not. And that, he realized, was the blueprint's greatest and most unsettling power when Wu said no one knew it was being used at all. By 1947, the glow of victory had turned into the hard glare of a new economic reality. Factories converted their assembly lines from tanks to toasters. Soldiers traded uniforms for gray suits and briefcases. And America, a nation now overflowing with optimism, money, and competition, began fighting a different kind of battle. Not against enemy armies, but against the attention of its own citizens. In this new battlefield, the blueprint was no longer a tool of wartime necessity. It was becoming something else entirely, a weapon of desire. Dr. James Vickery watched this transformation with growing unease. He noticed it first in magazines. Pages that once featured modest product descriptions now pulsed with emotional cues. Images of perfect families, confident men, glamorous women. The copywriters weren't describing products anymore. They were telling stories. Stories that promised fulfillment, identity, belonging. Vickery recognized the structure instantly. Emotional contrast, scarcity, authority, narrative resolution. These were the precise building blocks he had designed during the Blitz to stabilize a terrified nation. But here, in glossy full-page spreads, they were being used to fasten psychological hooks into the American consumer's heart. The same methods that had rallied civilians to endure bombings were now gently, almost invisibly, reshaping what people wanted, feared, and believed they needed. Richard Holden had risen rapidly through the advertising ranks. His campaigns were praised as revolutionary, scientific, and irresistibly persuasive. Colleagues wondered how he managed to predict consumer reactions with uncanny accuracy. They couldn't he know that Holden had memorized the blueprint S-core triggers in meetings. He spoke in terms Vickery had once used only behind sealed bunker doors: identity reinforcement, emotional anchoring, trust symmetry. For Holden, the war had been a classroom, and now Madison Avenue was his battlefield. One evening, Vickery attended a private seminar. Holden delivered to a group of rising executives. He sat at the back of the room, unrecognized. Holden clicked through slides, showing how certain colors increased purchasing intent, how repetition built authority, how stories induced compliance. The audience scribbled notes. In Holden's closing line made Vickery's stomach sink. "You not selling products. You're selling emotions people don't realize they're missing." The room erupted in applause. Vickery felt cold. During the war, these techniques had guided terrified civilians toward safety. Now they guided Wallace. Outside the seminar hall, Holden spotted Vickery in the hallway. For a moment, both men stood silently, the hum of the city muffled behind heavy doors. Holden smiled faintly. "James," he said, "you should be proud. This work will shape the future." Vickery shook his head. "It was never meant for this." Holden shrugged. "Tools evolve. Once people know what moves the human heart, they won't go back to guessing." His casual tone chilled Vickery more than any air raid he had lived through. That night, Vickery lay awake in his hotel room, listening to the distant rumble of traffic, so different from the wartime sounds he once knew. He realized something profound. The blueprint had crossed a moral threshold. It no longer guided the public through danger. It now persuaded them through longing. Engineered longing. And unlike wartime, there were no regulations, no ethical barriers, no commanders demanding restraint. In peace, the code had become even more potent. Vickery understood then that the battle for the human mind had not ended with surrender. It had simply changed uniforms. By the early 1950s, America was no longer simply consuming products. It was consuming promises. The nation had entered an era of unprecedented economic growth, and competition between corporations had escalated into something resembling an arms race. But instead of tanks or aircraft, the weapons were emotions, symbols, and psychological triggers. What began as a wartime code had become the most valuable currency in corporate America. Companies didn't just want attention. They wanted loyalty. They wanted reflexes. They wanted the consumer's mind, and behind every campaign, every billboard, every television commercial, Vickery saw traces of the blueprint, twisted, enlarged, accelerated. Television became the new front line, with millions of American families gathering nightly in their living rooms. Advertisers realized they now had the equivalent of a national broadcast bunker, a space where influence could be delivered without resistance. The pacing of commercials mimicked the structure Vickery had documented during the Blitz. Rising tension, emotional dip, promise of resolution. Characters mirrored the relatable archetypes used in wartime morale films. Even the placement of products on screen reflected the ministry's early experiments on visual dominance and trust. Vickery watched these patterns with a sinking heart. The public believed commercials were entertainment, but he saw them for what they truly were: psychological operations repurposed for profit. The more companies adopted the blueprint, the more aggressive the tactics became. Scarcity messaging, once used to encourage responsible rationing, was now used to induce panic buying. Authority cues, originally part of wartime leadership communication, became celebrity endorsements, and lab coats claiming scientific certainty. Emotional anchoring, once designed to steady civilians during air raids, now fueled commercials that suggested products could mend families, restore confidence, or cure loneliness. Vickery recognized every framework, every trigger. He had invented the skeleton. Corporate America had given it muscle. The major corporations began hiring psychologists, not to provide therapy, but to refine persuasion strategies. Former military analysts found new homes in boardrooms. Behavioral researchers migrated from universities to advertising agencies. And slowly, a quiet, invisible Cold War emerged, not between nations, but between corporations, vying to decode and exploit human desire. Each company sought deeper insight, more precise segmentation, more powerful emotional hooks. Vickery received letters from former colleagues in the ministry warning him that similar practices were appearing overseas. Influence had become global, and no one, not the government, not the public, not even the original creators could control it anymore. One evening, as Vickery walked through Times Square, he paused beneath a towering billboard glowing in electric color. A smiling woman held a product he'd never heard of, her expression warm and reassuring. The message beneath her was simple, comforting, almost patriotic, but the structure was unmistakable. Emotional contrast, identity reinforcement, repetition embedded in the slogan, a promise written in the language of psychological predictability. People passing by pointed, laughed, admired, unaware they were being guided, nudged, steered. Vickery watched them, feeling as though he were witnessing a silent reenactment of wartime strategies, except now the stakes were wallets, not survival. That night, he returned to his apartment and opened the last surviving notebook from the ministry. On the first page, written in faded wartime ink, were the words he had once believed were protective. If you understand a man's fear, you can predict his choices. He stared at the sentence for a long time. Fear had once kept a nation alive. Now, corporations had learned to manufacture its cousins: insecurity, aspiration, envy, desire. And the code built to defend millions had become the blueprint for selling them anything. By the mid-1950s, the blueprint was no longer a quiet influence buried in the practices of a few ambitious advertisers. It had evolved into a full-fledged scientific pursuit. Universities began offering courses in consumer psychology, though none of the professors understood they were teaching diluted fragments of Vickery's wartime research. Corporations funded entire departments dedicated to studying human behavior, and in labs tucked behind mirrored glass, researchers measured heart rates, pupil dilation, and the subtle twitch of hands when subjects viewed different images. They believed they were pioneers, but Vickery saw it differently. They were refining a tool born in a moment of existential fear, turning it into something sharper, smoother, more irresistible. Some of the most aggressive developments came from a rising concept called motivational research, pioneered by market analysts like Ernest Dick. These researchers argued that consumers didn't buy products. They bought emotional fulfillment. They bought identity. They bought illusions. Vickery watched these ideas spread like wildfire. each study adding new layers to the blueprint. Subconscious symbolism, emotional drives, psychological biases. Advertisers now used words like penetration rates and impulse activation, unaware their terminology echoed the ministry's wartime reports. What had once been an emergency effort to stabilize a traumatized population had become the engine behind an economy built on perpetual desire. The corporations that adopted these methods soon outpaced their competitors. They could predict which slogans would become catchy, which colors would evoke trust, which narratives would compel action. Grocery stores were redesigned to guide customers through psychological funnels, scarcity zones, sensory traps, emotional anchors. Cigarette companies launched campaigns that linked smoking to independence, masculinity, and emotional relief. Soap brands sold self-worth. Automakers sold power. Beverage companies sold belonging. Each advertisement was a story engineered to bypass logic and target the emotional levers. Vickery had mapped under bomb shelter conditions, and the public, unaware of the invisible architecture surrounding them, moved through this new world as predictably as the ministry's charts had once forecasted. The turning point came when corporations began experimenting with data, a word that had barely existed during the war. They collected surveys, purchasing logs, mail-in forms, even the order in which consumers flipped through magazines. Everything was measured, not because the data mattered on its own, but because it helped refine the blueprint. It allowed companies to test emotional triggers with the same precision Vickery had used when testing wartime radio scripts. A new phrase emerged in advertising: behavioral insight. Vickery winced every time he heard it. Insight was no longer a tool for survival. It was a commodity. One morning, Vickery received a letter from an old colleague at the ministry who had transitioned into a government advisory role. "The private sector is outrunning us," she warned. "Their influence is deeper and faster than anything the wartime departments ever achieved." Vickery folded the letter slowly. He remembered the terror in the eyes of civilians during the Blitz, helpless, desperate for guidance. He remembered how carefully he had calibrated the blueprint to avoid exploitation. But now, the same code was being used without restraint. Influence was no longer a protective force. It was an industry. That night, Vickery stood outside a cinema, watching a crowd gather beneath a marquee flashing with bright colors. The movie posters displayed perfect faces and bold taglines, engineered for emotional impact. Families lined up eagerly, unaware that every element, from the design of the ticket booth to the pacing of the trailer, followed the patterns he had uncovered years ago in a basement lit by a single weak lamp. He realized, with a mixture of awe and dread, that the blueprint had escaped even its creators. It was no longer a secret. It was no longer a tool. It was a science. And the world was now built on its foundations. In 1957, more than a decade after the war ended, Dr. James Vickery found himself sitting alone in a dim auditorium in New Jersey, watching a new kind of experiment unfold. A young marketing executive had invited him discreetly, saying only, "You'll want to see what we're doing with your ideas." The room was dark, the air cold, the projector humming softly behind him. On the screen, a short film played harmless footage of a family picnic. But Vickery wasn't watching the actors, he was watching the flicker. Buried between the frames were words so quick the conscious mind couldn't register them. Drink cola. Eat popcorn. Vickery felt a chill climbed his spine. He leaned forward, heart tightening. This wasn't persuasion anymore. This was intrusion, a direct attempt to bypass awareness altogether. The blueprint had crossed its most dangerous threshold. After the demonstration, the young executive approached him with an eager smile. "It works," he said proudly. "Sales spike every time we run the hidden messages. We're calling it subliminal projection." Vickery stared at him, stunned. It had taken years of research for him to understand the delicate architecture of the human mind, and now corporations were firing psychological triggers like artillery shells, indifferent to consequences. "Do you know what you're doing?" Vickery asked quietly. The man shrugged. "We're using science to sell more." "Isn't that what progress looks like?" Vickery turned away, swallowing the rising anger. During the war, every use of the blueprint had been weighed carefully, with ethical guardrails, military oversight, and moral caution. Here, the guardrails had vanished. Influence had become a contest of ambition. Soon after, Vickery traveled to Washington for a conference on emerging advertising ethics. He had been invited as a guest observer, ironically, to help evaluate the very methods he had helped create. In one session, executives debated how deeply emotional manipulation should go. Should campaigns induce insecurity? Should they simulate fear? Should they use nostalgia to trigger spending? The conversations were clinical, detached, almost mathematical. Vickery sat in silence, watching as rows of professionals reduced human vulnerability to charts and percentages. It felt like watching surgeons discuss how to operate without an aesthetic. The moral dimension, the soul of the blueprint, was disappearing. During a break, a young woman approached him. "Dr. Vick," he nodded gently. She lowered her voice. "My father served in Europe. He still has nightmares. I heard your work helped civilians cope during the war. Is it true they reusing the same methods to sell us things?" Her question struck him deeply. He wanted to reassure her, to offer comfort. Instead, he simply said, "The methods were meant to help. But tools don't choose how they're used. People do." As she walked away, Vickery realized the truth he had been resisting for years. The psychological code was no longer in the hands of governments or academics. It belonged to an industry built on competition, profit, and unchecked ingenuity. That night, Vickery returned to his hotel and opened his final war-era notebook, the one he had never shown to the Americans, the one that contained the full, unfiltered blueprint. As he traced the faded ink, he realized with a sharp, sinking clarity that everything they were witnessing, subliminal messaging, emotional engineering, behavioral prediction, had been inevitable. Once the door was opened in 1943, no force on earth could close it again. The code had escaped the bunker. It had infiltrated advertising, politics, media, entertainment, and the world now moved according to its rhythm, like dancers unaware of the orchestra controlling the tempo. In that quiet moment, Vickery understood the truth he had long feared. The greatest influence created in World War II was not a weapon, not a machine, not a strategy. It was a psychological architecture, and the modern world was built upon it. He closed the notebook slowly. The war was long over, but its most powerful creation was only beginning to shape the future. In the spring of 1960, Dr. James Vickery walked through the noisy heart of New York City. Surrounded by glowing signs, fast-talking salesmen, and magazine kiosks overflowing with headlines engineered for maximum impact, the world felt brighter, louder, more restless than the London he once knew. Yet beneath the color and noise, he sensed something familiar, the unmistakable rhythm of psychological influence. Every billboard, every radio jingle, every supermarket aisle arrangement echoed patterns he had charted years earlier. The blueprint was everywhere now, woven into the fabric of daily life. But most people didn't see it. They breathed it in like air, unaware of its origin in a dim, dust-covered bunker built during humanity's darkest hour. Vickery had been invited to deliver a private lecture at Columbia University. Tip topic was communication strategies in modern society. But the faculty didn't know they were hosting the man who had helped design the very strategies they were studying. In a small lecture hall, Vickery stood before a room of eager students. He spoke calmly about empathy, narrative, and the responsibility inherent in understanding human behavior. He did not mention the Midnight Group, the ministry's underground rooms, or the fear that had shaped his findings. But as he spoke, he realized that the students' questions reflected a new era, an era where influence was considered dangerous, but necessary. They wanted to know how to persuade faster, more effectively, more invisibly. Vickery's heart sank. He had hoped the next generation would be more cautious. Instead, they were more ambitious. After the lecture, a professor walked beside him down the hallway. "Your perspective is unusual," the man said. "It's almost..." Morel Vickery gave a tired smile. "Understanding people gives you power," he said quietly. "But power without restraint becomes something else." The professor nodded thoughtfully, but Vickery could tell the message didn't fully register. The world had moved on. The fears of war were fading, and the appetite for influence, for shaping opinions, desires, identities, had grown insatiable. The professor thanked him for his insights, unaware that Vickery was speaking from the experience of someone who had seen the birth of modern persuasion inside a concrete bunker trembling under enemy fire. Later that evening, Vickery visited a department store. He walked slowly down the aisles, observing how products were arranged to trigger impulse, how lighting created emotional warmth, how music subtly shifted pacing and mood. A young couple laughed nearby, pointing at a display that promised confidence in a bottle. Vickery watched them fondly, yet with quiet sadness. They weren't doing anything wrong. They were simply living in a world where emotional influence had become an invisible language, one spoken fluently by corporations, marketers, politicians, and storytellers. And no matter how intelligent or self-aware people believed themselves to be, the code that guided them traced its ancestry back to the war. Outside, dusk settled over Manhattan. Vickery found a bench near the river and sat down, letting the cool air wash over him. He thought about the civilians he had met during the Blitz, terrified, exhausted, desperate for guidance. He had built the blueprint to help them survive. But survival had evolved into consumption, reconstruction, into persuasion. The code had outgrown him, outmaneuvered him, and outlived him. And he knew that someday, future generations would refine it even further, turning it into something he could barely imagine. As city lights flickered across the water, Vickery finally allowed himself a moment of acceptance. Influence was not inherently evil. It was a tool, one capable of guiding, healing, inspiring. But it was also capable of steering societies quietly, shaping beliefs without consent, and selling dreams designed by someone else. The blueprint's legacy would always rest in the hands of those who wielded it. He rose from the bench, straightening his coat, and looked once more at the glowing skyline, a monument to progress built atop invisible foundations. The war had ended long ago, but its most enduring creation lived on, unseen, shaping choices, emotions, and beliefs with every passing day. And that invisible legacy, the psychological code of World War II, was now the pulse of the modern world.